This is the Blueprint podcast, bringing you the latest in cyber defense and security operations from top Blue Team leaders. Blueprint is brought to you by the SANS Institute and is hosted by SANS Senior Instructor John Hubbard. And now, here's your host, John Hubbard.
On this episode of Blueprint, we've got a very interesting topic we have not yet covered, and that is insider threat detection. We'll discuss the definition of insider threats, the different categories of insider threats, and the tools and models you can use for insider threat detection. All that and more today on Blueprint. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blueprint podcast. Today on the show, we have James Rowley, detection engineer at Yahoo, and a specialist in one topic that I'm really interested in getting into. It's another one I haven't really had a chance to dive into, and I'm really excited to hear the details. That's insider threats. So, James, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me. Excited to be on.
Fantastic. So let's hear a little bit about you. What's the kind of path that you've taken to getting kind of into information security and especially into insider threat? And what are you up to now?
Yeah, it's been a journey and it's been a fun one for sure. I came out of college really not knowing what really in the InfoSec world, where I was going to land. I knew I had this cybersecurity degree. And from there, I ended up with Booz Allen. And so at Booz Allen, they were like, hey, do you want to do this, incident response? It's on the commercial side. I think you get to travel. And so from there, got to go to a bunch of different, clients. And that's, kind of one of my things when it comes to consulting. It's fun because you have like a new job, every 6 months to a year. And so going around, experiencing all of what I experienced with these different clients, got to really kind of figure out where I fit. And what I realized right away is that I absolutely loved taking data and making a story of it. And so with that story, working in SOCs, doing incident response, just continuing to evolve that and, landed in a consulting gig where we were, tasked to build out an insider threat program. And when we were trying to figure out, all right, so how are we going to do this? I at that point had never done insider threat. And I was like, what really is insider threat? So here I hit, Google, looking through everything, and find that, it's really not that different from, a SOC in terms of looking for anomalous things, building a picture, understanding a motive, and boom, you have kind of a story. And so, 2 gigs later, I am doing the, whole insider threat thing, building it out. People are like, oh, wow, we can actually see this picture pretty clearly, and move on to end up with Yahoo. And now here I am as a detection engineer, helping support all things detections from the incident response and, the SOC and also the insider threat side. So.
Very, very cool. Yeah. So I love the SOC background. Obviously, that's something I share in common with myself. So it's always interesting to see kind of people's routes and how they end up where they are and being experts in whatever they've kind of landed on. Insider threat's a really interesting one to me because on one hand, it's one of those things where you're like, man, I really wish I didn't have to even do this at all, right? Because we have employees, we want to trust them, everything's great. But sometimes things happen, right? And when you have trusted insiders being the people that you are considering, maybe some trusted insiders, there's kind of various cases, which we'll kind of cover in future questions here. But it can be very destructive, right? It's one of those things where the access is there, the trust is built, and it's a very different game, probably in a lot of ways than looking at an external threat. So if you're an organization looking to set this up, where do you kind of start with that? Because my normal advice is pull up some threat intelligence, see what the attacks are and all that, but you can't do that for your employees. So where do you even begin with this kind of thing?
Yeah, it's not an easy concept to start, but when you start thinking about it, I really do think about it from that SOC and incident response background that I have of, what your insider is someone who has, is kind of like an outsider, but with the keys to the castle. right? And so if you kind of think of it from that aspect, then things start to line up a little bit better than, kind of what you had before. So when it comes to insider threat like programs, I think, classically people, kind of put this like James Bond-ish kind of like villain sneaking in and, making them seem like someone else, always the picture of like Pink Panther, going along the wall where he's like blending in with a different wallpaper background kind of goes through my head in that aspect. But, it's not that different. And, that's kind of one of the things I want to, hit home today is that when you're thinking about it, you don't need a whole different program. You don't having an insider threat program definitely is what you want at the end of the day, but you don't need a whole different methodology or even a whole new set of tools to really build this out. When it comes to insider threats, it's really just being able to take actions just kind of like you would within a sim, and building a story out of it. And, that's what I love, making stories out of data. And so that's really kind of where you want to go with that.
Very cool. So I guess in asking that question, I realized that I made an assumption that might be an error here. Different people I've talked to at different organizations have very different definitions of insider threat. And you kind of hinted at one when you said that, but I've heard everything from, well, it's an employee with actual malicious intent to it's someone who has insider access, but maybe a hacker's controlling their account. Like, what counts as an insider threat to you? And do you have any kind of ways of categorizing them?
Yeah. And so, one of the things that I think that as an organization, you have to like work with your other cybersecurity teams to really, define what is an insider for you, because you have existing processes in place for how you handle things, right? And so if, your incident response team is the one who's working on external adversaries, and so you're working with an insider threat team and all of a sudden realize that, it's not actually John who's doing this, it's, Alice who's doing this, and Alice is with some, external entity trying to, take information, then, obviously it changes. But at one point, the insider threat team would look at that. When you're looking for insiders, I think, I kind of bucket them into four categories. And these are, definitely ones that, I did not make up. These are industry kind of things. So I don't want to take any credit for it, but, you have accidental. So, they just made a mistake, right? So, they sent it to everybody instead of just, the person that they meant to send it to. You have negligent, someone who is, it's not accidental because there was not enough processes in place to stop them from doing it, but also they didn't care about the processes in general. You have malicious, people who are like, I am so angry with this organization that I'm going to, take it out on them, or they're just other things have happened, a bunch of stress in their life, and they're just like, what, screw it, I'm going to go do X, Y, and Z. And then you have your professionals, your spies, your James Bond villains. And those are kind of just like, the four that I'd bucket them into. And doing that kind of helps you understand the people, processes, and technologies that you can like actually use to, build out use cases.
I love that way of breaking them down. The accidental, the negligent, and the malicious group, they're all like people who you would consider employees, correct? Whereas the fourth one is external?
Yeah. And the idea, from the insider side is that you assume that they're an employee until you know that they're not an employee, right?
Gotcha. And so if we're dealing with something that appears to be a internal kind of employee sort of attack, at least initially, what are the tools and technologies that align best to those kind of groups as opposed to finding the kind of outsider villain type of insider threat?
I think when you're looking at those groups versus kind of more of the potential external parading as an internal, I personally do not use much else beside, because it's all about categorization, I think, is really what you're like trying to understand. So when it comes to, an external adversary, say they get into the system, they're looking around for things, and then, they're like, oh, I found the data that I want to take out, and they exfil that data. Well, from the insider perspective, we want to know what that data is before it's taken out, so that way we don't have to retroactively do that. Or maybe as a response function, that would be with the incident response, you would take and look at that data and say, not care that what data it was initially, just that it was taken, and then retroactively be like, hey, what was that data? So things like DLP might be something that gets more closely aligned with insider, but I think from a blue team perspective, having the knowledge to be able to lock down your data preemptively is a big thing that may not be considered classically a blue team or a SOC fire kind of thing.
We'll be back after a quick break.
If you're enjoying this episode, then you're undoubtedly interested in building the strongest security operations team that you can. For those who want to go even deeper, did you know that SANS has not one, but 2 courses that cover security operations centers as well? For the leaders, managers, and directors out there, my co-author Mark Orlando and I offer 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This course covers building your team, your physical and virtual workspace, getting the right data into your tools, and then focusing on security priorities through everyday execution of important security tasks and building the best SOC team possible. For the technical practitioners out there, my course Sec 450, Blue Team Fundamentals, Security Operations and Analysis is designed to cover everything you need to jump in being the best SOC analyst that you can be. We cover important data types, SOC tools, security logs, malware, analysis technique, automation, and much, much more. In addition, if you want to prove you can deliver the best on any security team, both courses have an accompanying certification available from GIAC. That's the GSOM for 551 and the GSOC for 450. Check out both courses and free demos available on the SANS website. You can get registered today for an in-person course at one of our many events, or go to On Demand and take either class anywhere at your own pace. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, so I guess what I had in my mind on that in terms of questions is I've had people, ask about, what should I think about DLP and UBA and all those sorts of tools? And we can dive deeper into that in a moment here. But I guess the surface level question I had about that is when you're thinking about, like, let's say DLP, is that something that's more or less aligned to employee type threats versus external threats? Or does it all, like, maybe it doesn't matter because you're taking a file and you're trying to get it outside the company, and who's doing it, doesn't really matter at that level of what kind of tooling we're dealing with.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. It doesn't really matter because no matter when we're trying to build that story, you have to have some kind of like framework to build a story.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether it be MITRE or the insider threat kill chain type thing, framework, I should say, to be able to see that, what you really want to see is someone or something progressing along that kill chain path to an objective.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't matter if they're insider, external, we generally, like to say, you like to think of the thing that we're reviewing when we're, building detections, not as like, a person, but as just like a set of data points that build up to some kind of thing. Like you can see kind of the progression along that chain of like, okay, so, all of a sudden there's a bunch of data downloaded. They're compressing that data. They've just downloaded a new application that turns out it's like a web application that allows you to move data, or, they are testing SCP and never have used something like SCP before. So, that kind of a story versus, John from our company is being really weird because we don't want to put associations to the people. We just want to understand the trajectory of actions.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like that way of looking at it, because I think if people go into this podcast thinking, well, I don't have any special tools for insider threat, the kind of picture you just painted here is you already got the tools. You're just you're finding an attack. It's just who's behind the attack is kind of the key difference, and whether it was John in accounting taking that file out or APT1 taking the file out. The file's going out, and you got to figure out if files are going out, right? And that's kind of the big problem. Very cool. So with that kind of picture painted, and hopefully everyone having hope in their mind, what are some of the things that you've seen, like anything that has hit the news recently, or any tales when if someone were to come to you and say, like, why is having an insider threat platform, insider threat program important? What are the kind of things that are happening out there that we're trying to stop?
Oh, there's so much, and it's all super interesting stuff, right? Like, you have car manufacturers who are getting attacked because some entity is trying to recruit an insider to deploy ransomware on their systems. That's pretty pretty big one that I think everybody has heard out there. There's multiple different kind of tech companies where there are executives or people who have been given trust of certain data, where they're trying to take that IP or trade secrets to their next company or to someone else to kind of to help get them to their next step, or for some kind of money increase or something like that. You have disgruntled people who are taking and locking down city networks because of some kind of pay issue or political issue or something that's going on, right? And then spying is another one that there's companies that are dealing with all the time. I feel like I kind of made this up, but it's also kind of like known out there. To me, data is money, data is power, and also for people, data is freedom. So if I can take the things that I've built in this company that may actually be trade secrets or IP for that company and take it to the next one, I'm going to get paid more. I'm going to already be 75% of the way there where I need to, and that it's just data, man, all data.
So yeah, plenty of unfavorable scenarios, we'll put it that way. Anything from destruction to just kind of loss through having your intellectual property, walking out the door, spies, ransomware, any kind of thing. Largely a lot of the same stuff that we're concerned, even without the insider threat thing, from happening from someone wishing us ill from outside, right?
Exactly.
So, I like that way of looking at it. Let's go back to the tools. What are the specific technologies and like data sources that people are using to build up and make the most effective type of detections for this sort of thing?
Yeah, and in my brain, these are things that you probably already have. It's just all about how you have taken those and looked at them and said, how does this look from not an egress or like an ingress, but an egress, something like that, right? And so, classically insider threat, we talked about this earlier, DLP solutions are huge, but then you're talking, when you get to cloud, you're talking about cloud access security brokers, or CASBs, right? Because there's, I feel like, a hot buzzword out there. You have, and for those specifically, that's understanding access to data and the type of data being accessed, right? So those are very much, data access focused. When you're talking about, any of the insider threat kill chains or MITRE, that's the early stages of things. When people are looking for things, people are trying to figure out what access they have, kind of doing that recon searching. And potentially, if they're downloading anything from, you have OneDrive, if your company uses like Dropbox, things like those. That's why people use cloud access security brokers, so that way they can monitor the files and access to those files and where they're being moved. Endpoint logging solutions, whatever you may have, EDR, whatever the new term for, any of the, those classic type of tools. I think out there, OS Query is an open source one that, people talk about, the ability for it to actually query DBs on endpoints is a really big thing for, in terms of like insider threat, because, you may have targeted solutions you need to like understand more. And that's a fun one out there. Trying to think, identity. This one's huge. So Oh, man, I can tell you, when it comes to corporate identity and understanding who someone is within the organization, it's not easy. And, I'll break that down a little bit more. These days you have FIDO, you have, single sign-on, you have some kind of, or if you don't have FIDO, you have MFA. You have not only your enterprise solutions, but your, actual production solutions, which all represent who the person who works for that company differently in terms of the GUIDs or UIDs or short IDs, whatever they may be called for that solution. Those are all different, and so having an identity solution that allows you to first get all of that information to tie it back to some kind of federated user via some single sign-on is absolutely huge. Because if I don't know that John's John, then there is no way I can categorize the things that are happening underneath that ID. I can only say that ID is doing things. But if I don't have that tied back to someone else, how am I going to build that picture of someone moving across the kill chain, right? On top of that, you have, when it comes to identity. Actually, pause. We can cut this spot. Because I'm starting to ramble. I was trying to figure out where I was trying to go with that. So when it comes to identity, when you're trying to actually be able to remediate as well, having a single solution that knows, I need to suspend John's accounts. What accounts are those to suspend? There are many times people are left with access because your identity solution hasn't taken into account that, say, this one, solution that we're using uses tokens. Those tokens live for 30 days. And so they actually have access to that 30 days post being suspended. And now you can't actually, you've lost the data, and you may not even have the login to say that you've lost X, Y, or Z data. So identity is absolutely huge.
Yeah, there's kind of two pieces of that. Where I thought you were going with that answer, and then kind of where you ended up taking is, in my mind, maybe two different things. Because you started talking about MFA and FIDO, and in my mind, he's like, oh, he's talking about how do I know John is John and John is not an attacker. And then we're also talking, is this number John, right? So it's kind of two pieces of the puzzle, right?
Yep, exactly.
How do we, back to that first piece, because I think you covered the second part really well. MFA and FIDO and all of that. How do we leverage those technologies now to help better understand that John is John, or not an attacker or something like that? Where are those playing a part here?
Yeah, and I think what I see organizations moving to do, and I think this is the right way to go, is using solutions that are doing some FIDO kind of biometric. So that way you're not only, signing in, but then you are giving something that is you to actually, confirm it's you, right? The worst case scenario you could have is, John's actually working with Alice. And so John is signing in as John from known John locations, but it's Alice doing all of the things, right? Or like John has turned on his, SSH, remote login on his Mac, and now Alice is over somewhere else doing all of the things from wherever Alice may be, and John is complicit in this, the kind of worst case scenario, right? And so I think when it comes to those solutions, being able to leverage some kind of analysis that says this is where John normally comes from, this is how John normally signs in, these are the steps that John normally takes, is huge in that. So not only are you taking the actual, technical data, but you're also modeling that behavior to John themselves.
Yeah. So that's a really good, I think, building block, which is what we're ultimately trying to approach here, of how do we get this right? Right. Is like step one is be able to track who is actually who. And that's in a, is this number John, and is John really John or someone else kind of thing, right? If a company thinks they're getting that right, how do they gain confidence? They're like, we've got this part covered, at least. Is there like a metric? Is there some kind of sign of failure that would tell you that like, actually, we need to work on that? Or how would you test such a thing?
I think that's $1 million question. I'll try my best. Right. Yeah. And so I think it's just, I think you need to take and look at multiple approaches to how you actually do identity within the organization. And you need to test those. If you don't have this is where I'll put my plug for, red teams out there. If you don't have a solid red team to like find the holes, you'll never know there are holes, right? Yep. And so you need to be able to trust that the tools and everything that are working. Okta, the big thing that just recently happened, I feel like in the news, right? That definitely degrades trust in those kind of things, but also proves the reason why we need other, you need defense in depth, right? Like I feel like that's one you go back to. I don't know when that first came out, but it's definitely an old technique or an old, methodology, but it's something that you need. So I don't think there's any answer. I think it's just, trust and testing is two things you definitely need.
If you've been with us through season 1 and 2, you've undoubtedly heard me talk about some of the courses that I've authored for SANS that are near and dear to my heart as a lifelong Blue Teamer. What you may not know is that every year and multiple times per year, these courses continue to get better. One of my favorite classes to teach is Sec 450 Blue Team Fundamentals, which is a technical class I designed for anyone working as a cybersecurity analyst for teams large or small. We've continued to update the class and bring in new information on the newest threats, data, and protocols that any defender needs to be aware of. In the most recent course refresh that went live just about a month ago, I've continued to hone the content, diving further into cloud defense, automation examples, detection for modern attacks and attackers, including common things like ransomware and much more. And we've also brought increased focus on new and more difficult to monitor network protocols like HTTP2 and HTTP3, DNS over HTTPS, and TLS 1.3, things that every Blue Team needs to be familiar with or will need to be very soon. Every version of this class comes with continued focus and updates, and this class is huge. I don't know of any other security operations course out there that contains nearly 1,000 pages of slides and notes, 15 hands-on labs with a virtual machine to go with them, including another 400 pages of step-by-step exercises for those hands-on exercises, video walkthroughs of all of those exercises, MP3s, a course wiki, and a whole day CTF where you can apply the skills you've learned in class throughout the week. My goal with this class is to bring you the absolute most comprehensive security operations and analysis course possible, and I'm continuing to strive with every release to keep updating the course and deliver on that mission. The depth of content in this course is something that SANS is uniquely positioned to deliver, and I hope you'll check it out if you have a free moment. Go to sans.org/sec450 to check out the free course demo, which is a free full section of the course, and an in-depth syllabus to see if it's right for you. We have options to take it live in person, live online, or at your own pace with SANS On Demand. And unlike some other training courses, SANS and I are there to help you along the way with personalized help and explanations for any questions you may have. With the recent release of the GIAC GSOC certification, anyone that takes the class can now get the corresponding certificate that shows that you've put in the work and have what it takes to go head-to-head with modern attackers. I really think we put together something special here, and I hope you check it out. Thanks for listening, and now on with the show. I'm always interested in kind of asking guests who are experts in the field, like, how do we know we're getting it right? Because a lot of companies may feel like, oh, yeah, we got this under control or whatever. But when the rubber really hits the road, right, it's like, is it going to work, right? And so usually the answer often comes down to how do we test it, right? Red team testing and all those sorts of things. So always good to give people a way to kind of sanity check what they think is working and those sorts of things. Another kind of related question I had to that is, and I know, from working in a large corporate environment in the past, DLP obviously plays a huge part of this, as you mentioned. What is, how should I phrase this? How can we gain confidence that DLP is doing the things that it should be doing? And how much can we trust it? Like, in your experience, is it something that can be bypassed in certain cases? Or is it like, no, that generally works as long as you set it up correctly?
Yeah. And so DLP, man, first thing I want to say is it's not an insider tool. It is a corporate tool, right? When I feel like people look at insider threat programs when they go to build them and they're like, oh, I'm going to do a DLP program. And it's like, no. Oh, you got to do more than that, right? But when it comes to DLP tools, it's really, and this is one thing that, I'm very much a fundamentalist in terms of, generally, most of the time, the tools that you already have are going to work really well if you put the time into them. I feel like people see the new and shiny and they're like, oh, we need to go get that. And then they just plug it in and let it go. But when it comes to DLP, what really works is when you actually sit down with business partners, sit down with actual different organizations within your company and really talk about what is valuable, where is these valuable things. And so like, what are like keywords and like, how can we essentially set up a cadence to be able to update this tool in a timely fashion that it will actually do the things that it says it will do. Because a lot of times people, they'll blame the tool for, doing what the tool does, but not ever put in the time to really get the tool to do, probably not more than what it does, but what it really can do, let it actually shine. And so, that's where I see it. Just you gotta put the time in. You've got to make it specific to your organization. Social security numbers, things like those are universal, and most DLP tools will come with that already pre-built in. Now that is, from a legal standpoint, that's good because you don't want to get sued. GDPR is a huge thing, all of that. But when it comes to protecting what really matters, that is on each company to really work and almost create these, an insider. I'm going to hop over and say, put a plug for action groups. This is where action groups are huge. And so, you might be thinking action group, I think I kind of understand what that means. But in insider, when you're talking about potential, internal employees, action groups are an absolute must. It's where you bring in your HR business partners. It's where you bring in your ethics business partners. You bring in, your incident response groups. You bring in your senior leaders, and you talk about the, thing that's happening and figure out your next steps. Because if those parties aren't bought in, they're not going to, you're going to go to them and tell them, and they're going to be like, what the heck is going on? Either freak out or be like, no, we can't do anything about it. But if you bring them in early on, when you have identified something, whether it be, an active like insider threat incident, or it be some kind of, tooling decisions, you really are going to get ahead of the curve on building out your program as well.
Are those groups that maybe you would say, like you want to practice and have like tabletop exercises involving the whole sort of group, so when it actually happens, it's like everyone's rehearsed and practiced, like that sort of like the larger crisis management group? Is that what you would? Because I haven't heard the term action group before, so I want to make sure I'm understanding, and I'm sure there's people in the same boat as me out there as well.
No, that's great. And I think putting an association with kind of your larger incident group when there is a very large incident that's business impacting is the right track. But generally, when you're in those kind of things, you're not talking about HR and like the actual laws that govern employment within different countries, right? And so it's that group, but a little more focused toward employees, but with also the right people to be able to, high enough up to make the right decisions and say, yes, you can do this, or no, you cannot do this, or like there's, getting your approval so you're good to go.
Gotcha. So with DLP, why I asked about the DLP thing originally is I recall, and I still always talk about this in class, is like we did a purple team test on the DLP solution we had back in the day, and we found it was like very Swiss cheesy because it was the first time we had tested it. We're like, wow, that did not get anywhere near as good of a score as we thought it would when it came to, common things like that. So is there any kind of process or any kind of thing beyond just, blatant, obvious testing, like of individual scenarios that we can do to gain confidence in whether it's DLP or really any of these tools? How do we practice, simulate, any kind of advice around that sort of thing?
Yeah, and I think the term is like cyber range, and being able to so testing. You say outside of testing, my brain immediately goes to testing. Uh, but outside of that, I think it's when it comes to really getting trust, it's you know I I think it is just testing. I don't when it comes to the tools, they're pretty advanced these days, and they can generally get to like a 7-layer deep zip, those kind of things, right? And be able to look at the data. I think you on top of that, metadata is a huge thing too. So not only do you see say this is a super non-suspicious file.txt, right? Goes out, DLP doesn't say anything about it, but you see something like that, you have other alerts that are like, okay, so a file went out, and I'll actually switch from the txt to being a CSV, right? So DLP didn't say anything, but it is still a CSV. So having other detections on top of just like your DLP tool, and making sure your DLP logging is in with your overall SIM logging and all of your other data. Because if I find that just like in SOC and incident response, because one of the things I did when I was also before I was building out inside threat programs was actually assessing and implementing new things into SOCs in terms of like processes on the technology side, building out new detections, things like that. Is being able to take that all of the different data sources and bring them into one, because you'll have siloing of the data. You shouldn't be hopping from this tool to another tool and then back to a different tool to view the picture. If you can bring all of that data into one, you then again telling the story, you can see what's going on. I'm atomic alerting is out in my mind. You can have atomic alerts, but you need to start thinking about statistical alerts. You need to talk about behavioral alerts. They're all kind of boil into the same idea. And then also, enrichment is absolutely huge as well. So if you don't have that, if you can't build that picture, you don't know what you're looking at.
Yeah, so that's actually a perfect segue into where I wanted to go next, which is UBA and UEBA. For those who may not be familiar with the acronym, User and Entity Behavior Analysis Analytics, I don't know which it is, but looking at all of this data in aggregate from all these different tools and trying to build that story. Can you talk a little bit about where UBA fits in and what you've seen maybe in terms of struggles, getting it set up or using it or anything like that? Advice to people that might be diving into using one of those tools for this.
Oh yeah, and I will be the first to say UBAs, UEBAs, they're great, but you have to really make it. And I feel like when you talk about this, I'm gonna be very very pronounced on this. It should be a UBA in terms of your organization behavioral analytic tool. And so it needs to be very much custom to your environment to be, an actual to work well. So when it comes to UBAs, a lot of them, there's a lot of great tools out there, a lot of different vendors who, they're like, hey, you know what, this will do ML, AI, throw out all those big, fancy words that people are trying to sneak into their resumes. So that way, the auto resume things like, yes, we definitely want to interview this person. But when it comes to it, that may work for you initially, but do you know what's actually happening on the back end? Is it doing is it thresholding the way that you want it? When you look at these kind of tools, a lot of them are essentially they try to advertise them as like no headache. You don't have to do much to make it work. And that might be right, but I want to know. This is always me. I'm super data curious. So how are you getting to the point of what you're doing? And so with that, I was like, you know what, throw that all out. Let's take and framework it out to build, your own kind of ability to look at all this. I think, with your logging solutions you have out there, it's really easy to take the data that you have and, kind of simulate that. You don't need to have ML and AI right off the bat. I think a lot of people, fall flat on their face when they're trying to build a model day one with the data that they have. A lot of this whole detection engineering kind of, looking at how to build all of this, it really boils down to taking small bricks, building a base, so then you can really actually shape your house the way you want it. And that's, I think people miss that because they want to go for the home run right away. And going for the home run right away just ignores the fact that you need to, go to practice, you need to, show up, you need to stretch, all of that other stuff to be able to hit that home run.
So what kind of things, someone, who recently bought a UBA, what type of things are they looking at in their own environment to make sure they can actually do that customization? Is it a matter of like, look where the data is held, look where the VIPs are, and, assign those as priority accounts, try to predict what attacks might happen, put that into the system? Like, what are the actual actions people are doing in that sort of scenario?
Yeah. And so when it comes to, your, out of the box type of stuff, what you need to feed it data, like intentional data that what's going on within the data. You can't just throw, say, here's all of the data sources that were in my sim. Let's throw it all in there and then see what it tells me, right? No, you need to make sure that when you're looking at it, all right, so does it do some kind of translation when you get that random number that means John instead, and brings it to John. So when you're getting an alert, you're not getting an alert on, 00101 something, or you're, when it should be attributed to John, right? So if it's not doing that, those are one of the things you want to do right away. Like get it back to that kind of, a single view that is, that drives the picture for your story. That's definitely one of the first things. On top of that, understanding, working with the vendors to understand what kind of baselining are they doing, if they're doing any kind of baselining. Because one thing that, we found when it comes to doing insider threat detections is baselines are massive, because people are people. We wake up every day. If you're a coffee drinker, a tea drinker, you're going to make that sometime throughout the day, whether it be morning, midday. You're going to sign on at certain times. Like you have patterns, which you do, because we're very, very instinctual, and we just very habitual is what I was going for there. And you're going to do those, things over and over again. And so when it comes to that, you have to have some kind of baseline to be able to say, this is within normal for what John would do. So let's set the normal John baseline and find where, John is being abnormal. And then when you see abnormal, like, all right, so how abnormal is that compared to normal John?
Gotcha. So that may be a good kind of connector to my next question, which is, when we're thinking about these attacks and what normal is and, a baseline versus anomalies, what kind of like process model of an attack are you using? Like you mentioned insider threat kill chain, right? Like how is that different from the typical kill chain? And where do these detections kind of start off within that model?
Yeah. And, I think the insider threat kill chain, the main difference versus like the MITRE's attack framework, which a lot of, organizations are using these days, is really, it starts at a tipping point. And so there's some kind of, insider threat kill chain. And what I want to say first too is like, there's no right answer to how you framework insider threats. There's going to be multiple frameworks out there. You have to pick one that fits your organization. Insider threat kill chain, I like it just because it's super simple. It's 4 steps. You have tipping point, search and recon, acquisition collection, and then exfil and action. And so when you're looking at it, really the only difference is that first step, which is like a tipping point. And tipping points are, when, the employee is disgruntled because they didn't get a promotion, or, all of a sudden there is a massive loss in their family, and it just triggers other stressors throughout their life. And, kind of trickles down to them, either not paying attention, being that accidental or negligent, where they're just like, I don't care anymore, kind of behaviors. But otherwise, those other steps very much map to what you have in like, kind of a MITRE attack framework. And so it's simple, and it is the big thing is why, the insider threat kill chain is great. But it is easily mappable to things that are existing. So when you're trying to like talk about insider threat programs of the future, or like where to put an insider threat program, this is why, I say, it should be totally side by side with your blue teamers, because, the data's there, the processes are there. It just needs a different cut once it kind of is determined whether it's internal versus external.
Is the insider threat kill chain, right, being different from the traditional one? And in the traditional one, the strategy, of course, is detect the attacks as early as possible. And we kind of always say like recon is hard to detect. The tipping point, that's being a unique thing to the insider threat kill chain. Is that something that you would also say is very hard to detect, or is there some way to kind of try to predict that or minimize the chance that even happening? Like prevention is better than detection, as you always say, right? In normal defense, is there a way to prevent that or anything in that respect?
Yeah, and it is the hardest point, right? Because like how do I all of a sudden know that someone is going to, all of a sudden become a malicious insider? I don't know that answer. However, what I can say is, if I'm going to add in another thing here called critical path. So critical path, if anybody out there is looking it up, critical path insider threat is the Google to put in. Otherwise, you'll get other critical paths, and critical path for insider threats is all about the movement along kind of a, just a thought process to getting to that action point. So it's actually pretty much when it comes to, it's the pre-attack for the attack, right? And so critical path plus insider threat kill chain really kind of marry up well, but a lot of people may not think about, using both. And so when it comes to, your critical path, you have steps like ideation where, you're thinking about, all right, what am I going to do when I do it, up into the point of like actually doing the thing. And so in that, there is things that you can look at from an organizational standpoint to say, how can we, reduce stress for our employees so that way they don't move along that chain, right? Because if really what I love, one of the things I know I love about insider threat is the ability for insider threat to inform businesses on, just what they can do to be preventative in terms of like, stress management and mitigation for organizations, for employees within organizations. And it's a lot. Like, you're not talking like a new program you're going to stand up, you're going to, start being like, oh, you need to do all these things to make your employees better. But if you do have those organizational impacts and you do that post analysis and you see, hey, if we had it as an organization, something really simple like a pop-up for when you put in a USB saying, hey, did you know that this is against policy to move like any data to a USB that's not owned by the company, right? Like you could have prevented someone from doing that. And so those are the kind of things that, getting at. But yeah, it's really interesting because it's, when insider threat, it's kind of also about how like a person's brain works in a way. And so it's super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things you had mentioned a couple times that I wanted to touch on as well is you said this is something that, the team should be working side by side with the SOC or the blue team or whoever. I always get questions from students about what should be in the org chart where and who should be part of what. And a lot of times I think the answer to that question is it depends. But in your opinion, is insider threat something that should be something the SOC does? Is it that kind of an auxiliary group that works closely with them in the same data, or does it not matter, or is it very organizational dependent? Like, how would you place a org chart with this on it?
One of the, what you've seen in organizations in the past is that, insider threat teams do land really anywhere. It's kind of whoever decides that, hey, this is a really, a passion project of mine, so I'm going to take it on. So, see it end up in physical security, end up, within the cyber. Sometimes it's even ended up in like the executive, group of all things. But personally, what I love to see is it, be integrated into the traditional incident response program. But then, you actually have a set of insider threat analysts who live outside of it. So just like any kind of, I think these days, you talk about like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 analysts within SOC, and then you have the incident responders. However you have that set up, whether it just be SOC and then you have some kind of incident response team. What I really see as the future of insider threat is you take those initial alerts and you feed them into your normal incident response programs, but you have like runbooks or playbooks that give the analyst the power to say, hey, this actually looks like it's an insider threat issue, right? So let's escalate this to the insider threat team, and then they take over. So they're almost kind of the incident responders in that workflow, but for insider threats. And that's what really seems to work really well, because it then allows the insider threat team to be more focused on figuring out, working with their detection engineers, working on cases, working with the overall strategy of like, hey, how do we be better, right? Allows them to take a little bit away from that in terms of the day-to-day, but then also adds to, analytics that you may not, or detections you may not have thought about from the instant response or SOC side. You get to build upon that. And so it really, both of them grow together and get to be better. And then also, if you're starting a program, it'd be great to have, 6, 24 by 5s, already ready at your hand to like help you, right? To, make your program as best as possible.
Yeah. So it is something you think is worthy of a dedicated position, if possible, and budget allows and all of that. Like it's a unique enough focus that you think we should have SOC analysts and we should have insider threat analysts.
Exactly. You should. Yeah. Yep. Definitely. Because insider threat analysts, because there's also there's a whole aspect of when it comes to when you actually have an active incident, being able to interview and being able to like actually assess the situation. This is where like, those ex-FBI employees, they're great because they have done the interviews. They know how to ask the questions, right? And I'm fortunate to, work with people who are just super smart and can interview just like crazy. So I know something I could never do. I'd be like, so did you do the bad thing? And they'd be like, no. And I'd be like, okay, I believe you. Bye. Like,
yeah, that's the thing I wouldn't want to do at all. Right. And so that's a whole different kind of piece of it, having those kind of skills as well. Any like common mistakes or any kind of common road bumps that people hit that we haven't yet discussed that you see get in people's ways of doing this effectively?
Yeah, the action group idea, whether you decide to go with an action group or not, partnering with your legal ethics groups is absolutely huge. If you do not have their blessing, if you do not have their ear, you'll never be able to like actually affect overall change potentially, because, it'll never be addressed. But also too, you can't actually, it's one thing to be able to detect something and say, hey, we detected it. Look at the shiny thing. And then be like, well, okay, now we just know the shiny thing's there, but we can't do anything about it because, we don't have the policies in place. From an insider threat program perspective, you have to think, in a similar way when it comes to external threats, but a little bit differently. You have to also have policies in place that, are broad enough, but explicit enough to, to say that for someone to reasonably know that what they were doing is wrong, right? And is against the law or is against your policies. Otherwise, you can never, say you need to go get that, IP back. You can't. You going to court, you'll lose in an instant. Your lawyers will look at this and be like, yeah, no, there's nothing you can do about this. So knowing your policies, reviewing your policies, and understanding those definitely are things that, are going to be, some day one kind of things. Because if you don't make those asked right away when you start actually detecting things, you're not going to be able to see that. I think having your detection engineers, in as much of the insider threat processes as much as possible early on is absolutely huge, because from their aspect, they may not be experts in building out detections for insider threats, they may know how to do it externally, but if they are in the process of actually, seeing what goes on, they can really build upon that. And understand, the weak points, and get their brain kind of like changed on how that looks.
Gotcha. So maybe a final question here. Let's say someone builds a team operating, doing the right things. Same problem that you always run into with the SOC. How do you communicate the value of your insider threat program? Are there certain metrics you use? Are there certain stories you're telling? How can you make sure that people know that you're doing good work?
Yeah. This is, I feel like this is a very much, like a common problem across not just insider threat programs, but all other programs, which are like ROI and everything else like Absolutely. That. Right. And, when it comes to insider threat, I think the big take homes are when you are talking about what had happened, talking about also what could have happened, and trying to, find as many wins within the story as possible. Because insider threat, end of the day, it really is, you hate to have to, do that, because you want to implicitly trust all of your employees and people who work for you and contractors and everything else like that. Because Occam's razor always assume, essentially whatever you are looking at is actually, there's another thing to explain it that's not as like, as scary. But when it's talking to your, executives, and it's saying, hey, we may have had this happen, but what we have done is we have identified 4, 5, 6 things that we are going to do to, protect us better next time. Because when generally you're not, unless you're super advanced, you're not preventing insiders 100%. Something's always going to get through. But also too, being able to say, hey, we have covered this much of the insider threat kill chain. That's another good story to say, like, hey, so we can see all of these things. And then also saying, we have things locked down to a certain degree where trusted people should only be the ones who actually are able to get at that. And I feel like that's very much an external thing too. So
have you ever, and why I kind of wanted to ask that question is, in a SOC, it's bad enough when they're like, well, there haven't been any attacks. Do we need a SOC, right? And insider threat, it's even less frequent, right? So it's like, well, no one's trying to do anything. And like, well, maybe because we're doing a good job, but how are you justifying when nothing's actually happening that the team continues to need to exist if there hasn't been any attacks that you can report on?
It's what it comes down to is that adding value in other aspects. Right. So, from an insider threat perspective, the team is constantly looking at what holes are existing, and then constantly either providing solutions or working with teams to actually like create solutions or create mitigations. And so your insider threat team is not always investigating. I think what they're trying to do is, there's a solid amount of time you're doing where you're actually reviewing what's going on in industry and saying, hey, those things that we see out there, are they something that could happen to us? Because it's almost kind of like a threat assessment. Because your insider threat team is not only just a SOC style of reviewing alerts and everything that come through, but they're also your interviewers, and they're actually doing the response aspect. But then also on top of that, they also have to keep up on trends and everything that's going on. What new tools, what new technology is out there that's going to disable us from doing what we need to do? You look at MacBooks, you switch to M1, that's a huge thing. But now there's you're somehow either removing or adding something because you're switching to a whole new style of system. So those kind of things, and continually talking with your actual leaders and discussing these things is huge. And there's an overall thing of my background too. I also built out cyber fusion centers, fancy term, right? And you constantly have to be informing others, and like ticketing systems and things like that. essentially creating more of those. And that's, kind of your backbone of like saying, hey, this is why we're worth it, because we have impacted change across these 4 different things. So
awesome. So ultimately telling the story about how you've, lowered risk, mitigated potential, threats and all that sort of stuff. So very similar to what a SOC is doing.
Yep.
Awesome.
Exactly.
Well, I think that brings us to the end here. We're about out of time. So final thing, where can we find you online? Any good resources or links or anything people should check out if they want to learn more about this?
Yeah. LinkedIn is where I exist. James Rowley. You can find me there. In terms of resources, there's a lot, but it's also kind of like scrambled as well. So CMU does Carnegie Mellon University has a great program. If you ever want to get into the mind of an insider, they have a great thing. But when it comes to, when it comes to like detections and building that out, it's very much, there's not one place, but hopefully soon, working to, be able to create something that is, actually out there to help people with that. So that's kind of my goal right now.
Fantastic. Well, lots to think about for our listeners here. Thank you so much for being on the Blueprint podcast, James. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Very much enjoyed it as well. Have a good day, y'all.
Catch you later.